Afternoon, everyone. My name is Avela Njwambe, and I'm an associate researcher for SCIS. So I'm just going to introduce the next segment. So we are still continuing with the case study presentations. And then now we have our colleagues online who will be presenting. So we have Kachan Lama, who will be presenting with a colleague, Srinjana Baral. Just to provide a brief introduction on the people who will be presenting. So Srinjana Baral, or Dr. Srinjana Baral, is a researcher and practitioner of gender equality, social inclusion and governance in forestry, climate change and natural resource management. She has over 15 or 1.5 decades of experience in research and in the developmental sector in Nepal and beyond. She's managed the IDRC-funded economic empowerment of women through Forest Solutions project, and during her tenure with the Forest Action Nepal. Currently, Srinjana is the program lead in the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion at RESOFTC in Thailand. On the other hand, Kachan Lama has background in political science from Assam, India. She has more than 29 years of experience as a policy analyst and gender equality and social inclusion, so GESIS specialist in NGOs, bilateral and multilateral UN organizations in Nepal. And in Central Asia Pacific region. So her key expertise lies in qualitative research, training, and impact evaluation for transformative change processes. So they will be presenting their research. Their presentation is titled "Intersectional Research for Women's Economic Empowerment Through Forest Solutions in Nepal." So I am going to hand over to Srinjana because I think she's the one who's going to be giving the presentation. Srinjana, you have 30 minutes to present, and then afterwards we'll take the next presentation, and then we can open up for questions and answers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Avela. Can you see my screen? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So I am presenting on behalf of me and my colleague Kanchan Lama. We both were part of the research at Forest Action. So the presentation that I am going to do today is on the intersectional research on women's economic empowerment through forest solutions in Nepal. We would like to share the methodological experiences of adopting intersectional approach in our study and in our action research project. So before we move, I cannot move the slide. Okay, before we move, I would like to give a brief introduction to the context in Nepal. So Nepal has approximately 45% of its land area covered by forest, and which offers ample opportunities for forest-based businesses and also for allowing low carbon economies to grow. While most of the people rely on the rural livelihoods, and they have been challenged by the negative impacts of climate change, the disasters, and COVID at that time when we were implementing the project. And when we say these impacts, we say that there is differential impact of these consequences on women and men differently, and it is more exacerbated to the women's vulnerability. But in forestry context, women are considered as The conservators, they play an important role in conserving the forest resources. They play a pivotal role in conservations. And Nepal is considered a role model for implementing the community forestry program, a participatory forestry mechanism globally. So women have contributed a lot to forest conservation. However, despite of their efforts in conserving the forest, they are often excluded and marginalized in exercising their rights and benefiting from the forest resources. So this exclusions and exclusion from the benefits, exclusion from the rights is disproportionately affected amongst the women belonging to different indigenous groups. Dalit communities, Dalit is not a legal term in Nepal. It is considered illegal to consider someone as untouchables, but the word Dalit itself considers people with untouchability. So there is this category of social class in Nepal and in the South Asia region that people are also considered untouchable, but it's illegal to consider someone as untouchable. So these people who are land poor, landless, who belongs to the Dalit community, the indigenous ethnic groups, the women who are single or widowed are disproportionately affected by their access and control over the forest resources. That's why women in Nepal are like, despite of having several affirmative policies, statements, the constitution and several forest-based policies and agriculture policies becoming very much affirmative towards women, women have suffered a lot from patriarchal and discriminatory socio-cultural norms and institutional structures. So the women's ownership over productive resources, financial resources, and land resources particularly are minimal, not only in countries like ours in the global south, but gender-based discriminations are highly prominent globally. So we cannot be away from it. That kind of multidimensional discrimination that exists in Nepal is more amplified when gender is intersected by caste, ethnicity, age, education background, geography, and Nepal being a very diverse, having a very diverse geographic conditions, the altitudinal variation ranging from 61 meters to the Mount Everest 8848 meters high. There is a very high geographic variations, and a lot of area is covered by the mountains. So it also contributes to amplify the discrimination that women face in the country. So because forest and people's attachment is slowly becoming poorer, people are detaching away from the forest resources. So are the women's. People are these days more prioritizing the economic benefits from the forest, while the rural women's daily livelihoods depend on the forest. So there is conflicting in the people how they see the forest. So it's forest has a different definition to the women belonging to the rural communities, while to the women belonging to or to other people in the urban settings, it's something to be considered as aesthetics. So there is a discrimination on how forest is also defined. And because of this multi-dimensional discriminations that women face because of the intersecting socio-cultural factors, there are also barriers to women's economic empowerment and resilience as well. So today we bring the cases and experiences that we gathered by implementing 30 months action research project entitled Economic Empowerment of Women Through Forest Solutions. The project, as you all might know, is an IDRC funded action research project which aimed to generate evidence-based knowledge for women's economic empowerment through devising and designing different models of low carbon solutions and also forest-based entrepreneurial solutions to enhance women's resilience against climate change and COVID-19 at that time. So we intended to identify the constraints and opportunities for women and women's economic empowerment. We try to develop some innovative approaches and strategies to increase and sustain women's income and economic resources, in particular women's agency, and also develop and pilot several inclusive models of forest-based businesses that are focusing on low carbon solutions. So in this context, in Nepal, intersectionality is not only a multiple axis of social differentiation based on gender and age and ethnicity and caste. It goes beyond the racial discriminations to the broader perspective of multidimensional marginalization and operations within the society. So we had to take the intersectionality approach because we wanted to know and understand the within society dimensions of unequal power relations. So the research at its design phase adopted three different approaches, intersectional approach being the measure one, the participatory action research and learning being the second one, and women's economic rights was the third approach that we adopted. So in adopting intersectionality approach was also quite a challenge because the concept itself was not widely understood by everyone, by the team members and the stakeholders as well. It was difficult for us to explain why we were targeting intersectionality as an approach in our action research project to the stakeholders as well. So we also adopted an participatory action research and learning, and where we wanted to share like the power sharing between the project staff and target communities was quite balanced. We adopted conscious strategies of mitigating unequal power relations through critical reflexivity and consciousness in the project design and planning and implementation. So whatever we did was done in a very participatory manner. No activities where the activities had the flexibility to adapt and integrate the women's voices and the decisions in the project. So for this study, we wanted to, like when we were understanding the intersectionality, we also thought of like it integrates not only with the intersectionality, but there is an intertwined relations between feminist political ecology and intersectionality in our case. So because feminist political ecology explains how and why inequality or unequal power relations exist, and they perpetuate or they sustain over time, and how women's access to and control over the resources are shaped because of these unequal power relations, and which are contested through the cultural and social norms. So we integrated the feminist political ecology and intersectionality concepts and theories in our study, because we wanted to understand how gender intersects with social categories and structural power dynamics to create differential access to and control over the natural resources and forest in our case. And for intersectional researchers, they consider how race, gender, class, sexuality, nationality, and other socially constructed dimensions of differences are always interacting to create the differences in the power relations. So that's why we wanted to integrate. And as per Kabir's feminist political ecology treats gender as a critical variable, and it shapes women's access to and control over the resources, and emphasizes the dynamics are contested through cultural and societal norms. So for this study, we integrated those two concepts, and then we realized that every person has multiple intersecting identities. So one identity might be a prestige for someone, being a woman can be a prestige for someone, but while it can be also quite marginalizing, triggering marginalization to someone else. So regarding the methodological tenets, we did not consider these methodological tenets as operations, relationality, context, and complexity in isolation, but consider them in relation to each other, so allowing us to explore and discuss the unequal power relations, because recognition of operation and power are central to understanding marginalization, to understand what are the factors that leads to dominations of someone, or marginalization or exclusion of someone from the decision making or the resource access process is the most important thing for us. So we considered these parameters or these tenets in relations to one another. For example, in our case, we not only consider the caste, ethnicity, age, marital age, and those kind of things. We also consider marital status, landholding, well-being status, and geography conditions as one of the major roles that played relational dominance and operations to the women entrepreneurs who were participating in the entrepreneurial journey. For example, we had the study was carried out in two different sites, one in the lowlands, which has a relative urbanization, and the other one was in a very hilly terrain, and the area was very fragile in terms of its geography and quite far away from the urban setting. So the remoteness of one site and the urbanized site in the other case in the lowlands were two different cases which we identified in our study to understand the intersectionality context, because the women that we considered for these cases belong to the same ethnic groups, had similar is were belonging to the similar age groups, but there were differences in access to the market, access to the resources, having the land ownership, and we wanted to see how these intersecting factors affected women's empowerment journey and women's entrepreneurship journey as well. So we consider, like, despite of being similar backgrounds, the women who had migrated or who had easy access to the market despite of not having the land ownership were more empowered, had more confidence to put their opinions, and had better economic opportunities than the women who had land holdings but were far away from the market access. So to identify the different intersecting factors, we had adapted different methods. Participatory mapping being one of them. Participatory mapping was one of the most important methods that we adopted in this study. So in participatory mapping exercise, we wanted to know how people were dealing with the power and how they were addressing the substantial issues. We wanted to see how they visualize their access and control over the resources. So the group of people, group of young girls, group of middle-aged women, and elderly women were requested to draw the picture of their community forest, and we wanted to see how they understand their community forest. And it seemed to, like, we found that women who were quite young, who were single, or who were young and widowed, hesitated to reach to the core of the forest areas, where the elderly women had that opportunity to know the forest much better. They had greater confidence in going to the core areas in the forest. The young women, they hesitated to go inside the forest. They were only going to the peripheral areas of the forest because they were not only scared of the wild animals, but they were also scared of the men whom they could encounter, especially the encroachers there. So this exercise was found to be, the participatory mapping exercise was found to be very effective. Apart from participatory mapping exercise, we also carried out storytelling accompanied by oral histories. So storytelling is, again, a very important and very impressive method, I would say, because the storytelling methodology helped us not only us to understand the local women's issues and the problems that they were facing, but also, like, it brought us closer to the women entrepreneurs, and they could also establish a relationship of trust amongst us, between us and themselves. So it was like, at the beginning, they were not very friendly. They did not want to share their stories of exclusion, their stories of struggles, of resource access. But when we started sharing our stories, there is a kind of cultural thing in Nepal that, like, people tends to be very friendly if we start talking about their children or their well-being status. So So we started that way. We started talking about our children and their children, and they started sharing the stories of exclusions. For example, we encountered a woman who was differently able. She had some issues with her leg, so she was not able to move properly. And when there was resource allocation for plantation activity, she could not travel to the place where the distribution was taking place, and she was denied of the resources. So if we had not adopted the intersectionality approach, maybe she would always be excluded from the resource access process. So taking intersectionality approach is equally important in every ways. Apart from storytelling and participatory mapping, we also conducted focus group discussions between single and widow women, ethnic landless communities, ethnic communities with land holding, but geographically distant populations. So these different categories of different groups of people and different interactions allowed us to understand the different dimensions of unequal power relations that they had. The single and widow women who were quite young struggled the most in resource access compared to the other groups of people, and the ethnic landless communities, because of their access, their proximity to the market, proximity to the resources, or had better livelihood options than the ethnic communities who had land holdings but quite far away, living quite remotely in the area. So apart from this, we also had our observations. We were part of the Action Research Project for 30 months. So our observations and our relations with the women entrepreneurs was also equally important. We participated in several formal and informal gatherings, meetings, and discussions, which allowed us to know and better understand the situation there. However, reflexivity was equally important. We need to understand our ethics and our responsibility as a researchers and our positionality as a researchers, and we have to keep that distance with them as well. So what we learned, so what was the intersectional praxis for policy and social change? So with this 30 months project, we realized that recognition of adopting an intersectional approach is very important. So without recognition of women, the knowledge that women have, is the change is very difficult. So to make people understand that women are equal stakeholders, not only at household level, at the community and at the national level, we had to capacitate the families. We conducted several couple training programs, which were very effective in making the men realize that women and men make the family complete and they are in no way unequal. So capacitating the men members in the family along with the women members was an important task that allowed us to enable the recognition of women as equal partners. And we also adopted gender responsive and intersectional methodology from the very beginning, from not only from designing and implementation, but also while identifying the consortium partners as well. So if we had not adopted intersectionality approach, the partners would have been different. The target women entrepreneurs would have been different. So because we adopted intersectionality approach, most of our beneficiaries belong to the Dalit or the ethnic groups. So they were belonging to the lowest hierarchies in the economic arena as well. So it was quite difficult to identify them, but we were eventually successful at doing it. And not only identifying them and capacitating them, we also provided funds and opportunities for economic activities. So for this, we allowed the women groups, the women with intersecting factors of facing intersecting factors of marginalization, to recognize the economic activity or the enterprise that they would want to consider for future. So they were given 5 days of training where they were supported to identify a particular business that they would want to carry out for rest of their life, I wouldn't say, but for a couple of years from now. So they were not forced to carry out any kind of enterprises, but they were given the opportunity to identify their own choices. And not only identifying the enterprises, the project also supported them with the resources in terms of funds, in terms of technologies, and technologies were obviously low carbon technologies that were quite women friendly. So those were the activities we conducted. And when we were establishing these forest-based enterprises, we also had encountered a couple of policy issues. For example, the community forest management plan, that is the basis for women to rely their resources on, where like the women's opinions or their demands were not incorporated. For example, we were like the women were uh, preparing what do I say, the biodegradable leaf plate. We call it's made from the Soria robusta leaves, and it's a biodegradable plate and balls that can be prepared. And when women entrepreneurs were trying to get these leaves out of the forest, it was not incorporated in the management plan. So there were restrictions. So what we facilitated in doing was that we facilitated the women groups to conduct the leaf inventory and then incorporate the inventory results in the management plan, and which were finally endorsed by the division forest officer, and which became the legal document for allowing their access to the resources. So not only their access to the resources, some women group, when they wanted to establish or register their enterprises, they also faced issues in the registration process, because not all the women had the citizenships. That was the prime document that they would require when they wanted to register the enterprise. It is because these women that we had targeted in our project were from the very marginalized communities. They were not aware much on the requirements for the citizenship and so on. So for this, to address this kind of several other issues, we conducted policy dialogues at the local level, where we invited the government stakeholders, the financial institutions, the local government, the divisional forest officials, and requested the women entrepreneurs to share their stories among the policymakers. So these policies would be addressed. So the policy dialogues were organized not only at the local level, but also at the national level, so that the policymakers would reflect on the policy revision processes. So other thing that we did was enhancing intersectional accountability. So how did we do it? It was with the choices that we had, the choice to identify the consortium partners, the choice to work with the local community forest user groups, and the coordination with the local government and local level stakeholders, because we were working with the grassroots movements. So we identified the consortium partners. As you can see, the project was jointly implemented by the Consortium of Forest Action, Himawantya Grassroots Women Forest User Groups organization. FENFIT is the organization of the business entrepreneurs, the forest-based business entrepreneurs, and F1 is the association of private forest owners. So these consortium partners were not only like facilitating themselves, generating the evidences through the research activities, but were also the end users of the knowledge that was generated, because they are all the grassroots organizations very strong in advocacy and capacity building of the community forest user groups. And when we were talking about the forest resources, we had to choose the community forest user groups. We not only have the community forest user groups, there are different participatory forest management modalities in Nepal, in addition to the private forest modalities. So we intended to work with the grassroots women groups. So we selected the CFUs so that it could be institutionalized through the community forest management plans in the country. And apart from that, we also developed the women leadership circle at the local government level, in the local governments that we were working, so that they would be supporting the policy formulation process. at the local government levels that would empower the women and integrate all the gender dimensions in the policy formulation process. So the challenge is, yes, definitely adopting intersectionality approach was a challenge in several ways. There were a lot of interference by the political parties, because when we wanted to reach to the women group who had these intersecting forms of discriminations, who had different factors that were, I mean, the multidimensional factors that led to their marginalization, the political leaders would want the people of their favorism to be the target groups for the project, because they would see that these individuals would be benefiting not only in terms of capacity building, but also through the economic empowerment journey itself. So there were a lot of interference, but despite of those interference, we believe that we could reach to our target communities. So there were different cases where people were not allowed to, like the women groups were not informed, or not, they were deprived of different things by the political parties, but eventually we could reach to the target groups with several discussions at different levels with different stakeholders at the local level. And there were also cases where we saw the double standards of elite women, though the women were in the executive committee of the community foresters groups. When it comes to the poor and marginalized and the Dalit and ethnic women, the elite women would not prefer the activities or the benefits to go to this group of people. They would rather want to grab it to themselves. And we had to do a lot of exercises to communicate with these elite women and convince them to reach to the women those were most marginalized. And there were also issues in understanding the different forms of operations, because issues related to women were mostly considered as women's issues only. So the women's issues analysis was quite difficult, very complex, very contextual, and also like different in different places. So it was quite difficult to understand. And apart from that, positionality and reflexivity, I think we already defined it in the case of our project. Our positionality as researchers was further defined by our location, and like people would sometimes consider us as the women belonging to their categories, or women who would understand their things and their opinions, but at the same time they would also consider us as the donors or people coming from the donor funded projects. So there were also like expectations on that side. So to conclude, we consciously, like, we adopted purposive methodologies because we wanted to adopt intersectionality in our action research projects. So we consciously applied different methodological tenets of intersectionality, including operation, context, complexity, and relationality in relation to each other, that allowed us to explore and discuss the unequal power relations that exist in the society. And among the different methods we adopted, we found storytelling methodology to be particularly well suited for understanding the women's issues, especially in the context like ours, where we have a very diverse, not only geography, but also diversity in terms of caste, ethnicity, and so on. So, for example, in Nepal, in a very small geographic area, more than 125 languages are spoken, that you could see the diversity of socio-economic diversity that exists there. So intersectionality approach has proven to be effective in uncovering the nuanced realities of women's evolving roles, which are influenced by different socioeconomic and political forces, as well as interpersonal relations within the households and the decision-making process. Thus, we recommend the need for further studies to develop gender-responsive intersectionality framework for women's economic empowerment. Well, thank you so much.
Sure, thank you so much, Srinjana. You just kept the time so well. We'll move on to our next speakers. So if you have any comments or questions, just jot them down. And then after the next speakers, we'll open for questions and answers. So, I mean, these two don't need introduction because I've heard that they are residents at SKIS. But I will introduce anyways. Our next speaker is going to be Mike Rogan, or rather Dr. Mike Rogan, or Prof. Apologies. Apologies, Prof. Mike Rogan. His presentation with Siviwe. Oh, okay. The title of his presentation is Interrogating Intersectionality, Considerations on Critical Inquiry and Praxis for WIGO's Actionable Research. Just to give a bit of background, just to give a bit of background, Prof is a professor in economics and economic history and a member of the Neil Agate Labor Studies Unit, so NALSU, at Rhodes University, my alma mater. So since 2011, he's been a research associate in the Global Research Policy Research Policy Action Network, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. So that's WIGO. So he holds a PhD and a master's degree from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from the University of Washington in Seattle. So Mike's research is focused largely on the informal economy or informal employment, gender poverty, food security, education, and skills development. So I'll give it over to you, Mike. So you have 30 minutes. I will be signaling to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got some slides. I don't know if anyone could. Yep, there we go. Well, I'd like to promise that I'll keep this short, but historically that's not been a strength of mine, or any of us really. Yeah. So thanks everyone. And it saved me on some of the introduction. I work with WIGO and have done for almost 15 years. Yeah, I've got the clicker thing here. Thanks. And as you heard in the introduction, technically we're a registered non-profit in the UK, but we're really a virtual global advocacy research policy network. The founders of WIGO, many of whom still work with the organization, prefer to call it a movement rather than a network. So it has an interesting type of structure, which I think makes this an interesting case study, and also speaks to one of the questions we had earlier today. How do you involve participants in the research? Well, this is a movement, so it makes it a little bit easier than a typical case, but we also have some of the same challenges. We're going to be reflecting on a specific case study, and this was a research project that we undertook during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was probably a good choice for a number of reasons. It was generously supported by the IDRC at the time. It was the most recent WIGO research project at the time of this intersectionality project. And I think it's a really good example of the way WIGO approaches research as a network or a movement or a collection of researchers and worker organizations. And this was really, just thinking about that earlier, sort of comment about whether this is causes discomfort to try and think of how you relate to intersectionality. We found this to be a really good exercise. So within WIGO, we had some people who said, WIGO's always been intersectional from the beginning, and other people sort of saying, well, there are aspects of intersectionality that sort of line up with the way we think about things. So this was nice a nice sort of opportunity to kind of think about how our work relates to intersectionality. And I personally really enjoyed reading the reports, which I think is excellent. And I'm allowed to say that because the first two authors there, Ana Carolina, who's perhaps joining us from Brazil, and Sibiwe Mhlana, really did most of the work on this. So I was really impressed with what they put together. But I get to speak about it today. So that's me. I was also quite involved with the COVID-19 study. So from a case study point of view, I'm happy to kind of speak a little bit more detail as we go. So this triangle here is for many years what WeGo was well known for. This was published in the 2005 Progress of the World's Women report. And this, I think, is really just a sort of fundamental sort of symbol of how people in WeGo, both our partners, worker organizations, and the research group in WeGo think about segmentation in the informal economy. And it starts to get to how we probably think about power structures and intersectionality. We call this the pyramid of segmentation. There are a couple of papers we've done where we test this empirically as well. I'm an economist, by the way, so I'm the numbers guy. Hannah, you mentioned earlier there's power in numbers, right? But it also strips out nuance when you use numbers. So that's kind of how some of this fits in. So at the top of the pyramid are the categories of work arrangement in which earnings are higher and livelihoods are more stable. So you've got employers in the informal economy who are essentially the owners of small informal businesses. Then it goes down to employees. Then it goes down to own account workers or the self-employed who just work on their own. Think about street vendors and waste collectors. Then you have casual, more precarious informal employees. Then you have a category called industrial outworkers. And back at this point, it was still pretty early days in the ICLS, ILO processes. So we now tend to refer to these as home-based workers. And then at the bottom, you have contributing family workers. So as you move down the pyramid, vulnerabilities increase, earnings are lower, and the proportion of women in each of those categories is higher. So men are concentrated at the top, and women are concentrated at the bottom. So what this sort of has always suggested to us is that there are probably two sources of gendered inequality. The first is in the type of work in which you're found, you're located, according to the pyramid. And then there are less visible types of gendered inequality within each type of employment. And that's where I think the nuance and complexity comes through as well. So I think something that we would all agree with at WeGo, irrespective of where we stand on intersectionality, would be that what causes the structure of this pyramid to be gendered, both hierarchically and within each of those categories, is the way that weak structural power, and in the reports, Anna and Sibiwe go into each type of power. Some of the other presentations covered that as well. The way these structural power imbalances intersect with systemic gendered inequalities and social norms, which often end up making women more vulnerable to the conditions of work in the informal economy. And we also mentioned earlier, this isn't all about women. People are often surprised in WeGo that we often work with organizations of men in the informal economy as well. But WeGo was really founded as part of the movement that we think of as being led by the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, which some of the older members of WeGo called the Mothership. And that organization largely organizes women in home-based employment. So that's where a lot of this focus on women in particular comes from, is the origins of the movement and the alliances we have. I should also say at this point, just to make it easier a bit later, in addition to those segmentations in the informal economy, we tend to work with what we call 4 sector groups, which are domestic workers, waste pickers, street vendors, and home-based workers. So when I get to the sector part of the analysis later, we tend to work with those groups, and they tend to organize themselves along those lines as well. So if you think about that pyramid, I think it would, and again, using the example of India, where WeGo really started, following on from Sewa, we would think quite easily along the lines of three different types of oppression or vulnerability or inequality sort of mapping onto each other. And if we think about, again, the context where the caste system is so dominant, you would have caste oppression, which intersects quite a lot with disadvantages faced by people who were laborers, and you could fit that into several of the categories from the pyramid as well, and then mapped onto that gender depression. So the way that those three levels of oppression sort of interact with each other, I think would be pretty compatible with WeGo's hierarchy of segmentation in the informal economy. So why is the COVID-19 study a good example of how WeGo does research? So we're an increasingly large network of researchers, so we do lots of different types of research, but I think this is a good example of how we've always thought we're at our best when we do research. So our understanding is that knowledge is generated with and for informal workers, and one of the things we like to do is put numbers in the hands of workers. If numbers are power, statistics are power, we try and put those in the hands of workers. And that's instead of being a research process on a marginalized group. So we tend to, and I'll give examples, co-produce with organizations of workers. Interestingly, we also have something that has become a mantra at WeGo, local to global and then global to local. So we still try to publish in those big fancy journals because it's nice, everyone likes doing that. But how do you take what you learn locally and extend that globally? And how do you take what's going on globally and bring that back locally so that it can be leveraged by partners and allies? So that's what we try to do. Some people at WeGo are excellent at this. Everything they do feeds back into the grassroots, and they publish in the best journals, right? Those are those colleagues that have it all. But that's the model. That's the way we think about research. When we started thinking about intersectionality and had some conversations with the IDRC, we also thought, well, how does that potentially fit into practice? Because we also have a component of our work where we support workers to organize themselves. So how do we think about intersectionality being useful there? Well, we could say that in some of the work we do, it's a tool for fostering inclusion of those at the margin. We think it's probably a useful approach for movements and alliances of workers themselves to use to assess whether the work adequately reflects the diversity of experiences on the ground. And it potentially offers sort of pathways or ideas for bridging multiple and intersecting struggles. But there's probably another side to that too, which I'll say more about when we reflect on our lessons. So that would kind of cover the research and practice approach that the WeGo has that probably aligns with intersectionality. So with this particular case study of the COVID-19 study, kind of one of the questions we had in the back of our mind was whether or how intersectionality brings nuance and complexity to our understanding and framing of how class and gender shape segmentation in the informal economy. So what would it add to that pyramid that we started with as sort of one of our founding ideas of segmentation in the informal economy? So the COVID-19 study was conducted across 11 cities, which we realized then and acknowledge now was a lot to do at the height of a pandemic. But one of the reasons it's probably an interesting case study is because what we were trying to do is understand how pre-existing inequalities and all their complexities and forms were worsening the effects or determining the pathways of the negative impacts of the pandemic. So we needed to understand how vulnerabilities and inequalities were being widened at that particular point, and then identify pathways to addressing some of those challenges. So we knew from the very beginning, we did a scoping study, that a lot of the pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities were likely to be related to the characteristics of workers themselves. And I'll show you a map where these 11 cities were to show that we were completely overambitious when we decided we were going to tackle complexity. But things like status, employment, sector, place of work, those things from the pyramid, as well as gender, migrant status, caste, class, in a lot of the contexts tended to be factors that really sort of interacted with other vulnerabilities, as well as practical things, structural conditions such as poverty, poor service delivery, low quality housing, limited infrastructure, and then of course violence and discrimination in many places. So we set out to understand what we needed to know about these differentiated pathways of impact of the pandemic and the way it operated both intrasector and intersector, so between different groups of workers and then within workers who on the surface had similar characteristics. So this is what we actually did. I won't go into the details, but the map here reflects where the 11 cities were, so you can appreciate immediately that the contexts were extremely different in almost any way you can think of. It was a mixed method longitudinal study. It was mostly quantitative with some qualitative follow-up, and it was longitudinal just in the sense that we did 2 rounds and we did the research with the same workers about a year apart. So the link is there if you want to download the report. But I think the important thing here to say rather is that the main output of this was not the report that we gave to the IDRC and published in journals. Every city consisted of a partnership with a membership-based organization of informal workers, and they were research partners. They conducted the research with us, and then we designed 11 different outputs twice, one for each year. And those outputs were designed and disseminated by the worker organizations themselves. The main output was getting information in the hands of workers in the form that they needed in order to advocate for their rights or their needs with their government during the pandemic. So that was kind of the model. In some cities, it worked really well. In fact, in one city, a group of waste pickers with an activist published a journal article. And in other cities, we supported more than we did, than we expected, right? Just kind of depended on what was needed at the time. So Anna and Saviwe have sort of put a matrix together. Saviwe is shaking her head, but so maybe it was Anna. Is that what you're... Anna's online, so if she's shaking her head, we can't see it, and that's a bit of a puzzle because then no one knows who did it. But they put a table together with these, and I saw the other presentations use similar terminology and refer to these as tenets of intersectionality. So in the matrix in the report, whoever put it together kind of gave examples of how each of these tenets of intersectionality kind of align quite closely with the way we analyze the data from these, or use the data from these 11 cities. So if you start with oppression, and it's called, what's the matrix of domination? Is that the word from the literature? Yeah. We analyzed across these 11 cities, and sometimes within the cities, depending on which were the characteristics of vulnerability, by things such as class. Sometimes it was just being informal versus formal, which made the biggest difference when the crisis hit in that particular context. Status and employment, that goes back to that pyramid of risk. Having an employer or being self-employed or being an independent contractor made a big difference to whether you could continue working during the period. In India and several Latin American contexts, being non-national, being a migrant was one of the biggest risk factors, and of course intersecting with gender and caste. So we were faced with these sort of different ways of understanding vulnerabilities. Complexity probably doesn't require too much more explanation based on what we were trying to do, but essentially trying to analyze the multiple forms of vulnerability across different structures. Context was extremely important, both in terms of how informality is positioned in each of those countries, and those of you who are familiar with some of the literature know that we think about informality really differently in Latin America versus Africa versus Asia, right? And so trying to understand how the context fed into the policy environment during the pandemic was really important. And then, of course, it was a challenge because if you remember that dark time, policies in each country were changing almost on a daily or weekly basis. So trying to understand how the policy shifts that were occurring so rapidly affected different groups of workers. And it was really surprising how the vulnerabilities switched quite quickly with the policies, that things that were shut down in our economy impacted differently on different groups. And of course, we had to come up with something to say about all 11 cities, which was a huge challenge, right? Now, how do you zoom away from the complexity? So we tried to frame it again in this intrasector and intersectoral approach. So we tried to say, between the sectors, this is how groups such as waste pickers were impacted in many places versus street vendors or home-based workers or domestic workers. And then we said, within each of those categories of workers, let's compare what intrasector vulnerabilities impacted how policy and the pandemic impacted livelihoods. So the report was, not surprisingly, much longer than we intended it to be, trying to get at all of this, but this was the way we were thinking about it. And then relational, in terms of how the analysis of common and differentiated policy demands by sector could be used to build worker solidarity. And I think the report also gives a few nice examples of how these different advocacy efforts resulted in policy change in some contexts. So what do we sort of think about when we reflect on where we've come from this? So Hannah mentioned some of the challenges earlier in the day about how there is a danger that focusing on intersectionality can highlight differences between groups when, of course, we're often trying to promote solidarity. So I don't think we put it quite that way in the report, but I think what we were saying was it was difficult to find a contextually relevant and comprehensive way to identify and ask in our research tools about different intersecting identities. Many research tools are quite blunt, so the second bullet point would just sort of say, I think most people would agree that quantitative approaches are not ideal for this, right? We're quantifying, we're not getting rich or nuanced data. But how do you get at this even with qualitative tools, right? It's difficult, and there aren't a lot of, I think, great examples of how to get at this type of information in a way that's contextually relevant and sensitive. And I don't think Anna or Savi, whoever wrote this part, were saying that this was a massive problem, but just highlighting it as kind of a methodological challenge.
Pretty
good. And then what about more broadly for using research in an intersectional way for movement building, which is WeGo's reason for being, essentially. So there are 3 examples from the report using this research for policy action, and the context of COVID-19 was quite important for that because not many people had data because we were all locked in our homes, if you remember. So the workers and the alliances we worked with had data, and they often used that to build other connections with other movements and to achieve policy outcomes. So there are at least 3 tangible ways in which the research was used to achieve a policy victory. This period, as I mentioned, was all about co-production. Not only was it kind of the way WeGo preferred to work, but during the pandemic, we needed the workers to work with the research because they knew their context. They knew how the knowledge should be used and which, in some cases, knowledge they needed. So this was a really interesting example of co-producing under very trying circumstances to achieve certain outcomes with target policy audiences. And then a number of, kind of in the follow-up and the evaluation of the project, a number of researchers at the local level and worker organizations mentioned the way that research opened up new relationships through the process of advocacy, disseminating the research, and also making connections between other groups of workers through the wider research project. So what would we say? How does WeGo's research or way of thinking about research and how we use it in our broader mission, how does it align with intersectionality? And I think that's the word we used, align. Not saying we are or aren't intersectional in our approach, but where are the complementarities? WeGo's overall mission, and in particular the way we think about our research, is in pursuit of a fair and equitable society, which I think probably reflects all of the presentations that we have here as well. The focus is first and foremost on actionable research centered on the experiences of workers in the informal economy. So it's the experiences of the workers that need to come through. WeGo has a theory of change that is based on something we call the 3 V's, voice, visibility, and validity for informal workers. And I think if we're true to our mission and sort of incorporate that in what we do with research and advocacy and movement building, it's fairly closely aligned with the values of intersectionality, in particular, in terms of trust building and attention to context, right? That's how we work in WeGo. And then finally, some of the challenges to thinking about intersectionality are, we also flagged along with several of the other case studies, that thing I mentioned earlier. If we're focusing on building solidarity, how do we focus on our differences and the different ways we experience things without distracting from the overall thing? And we're just putting it as a challenge, not as an obstacle necessarily. We definitely spoke throughout the project, and in particular in the reflection phase, about the need for more nuanced research tools to get at some of the vulnerabilities and the intersections that we're interested in. No one has the answer to that, but probably it's something on everyone's map as well. And then we really concluded with kind of this thing that several other groups have mentioned, as well as coming back to the beginning, who contributes to understanding intersectionality. There's the north-south thing that we spoke about earlier. And as it does become quite a popular thing and a concept, just to pay attention to who's using it and leveraging it, and which direction is it going, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? So something to keep a close eye on, but I think that echoes what a lot of people here have said as well. So that's our story. Are we going to retire to the lovely living room now, or yeah, good. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. I think you had like 5 minutes left, but you actually kept to time. So I am going to open up questions, and anyone that has any questions. So we have 2 presenters. So Srinjana online and Prof. Mike Rogan. So is there anyone in the room that has questions? So I'll take 3 questions and then give it to the presenters, and then I'll go for another round. So I saw that Matt has his hand up, and then I've also noted, and I've noted. So I'll give it over to you.
Thank you, Prof. Mike and Dr. Barral. I have 2 questions that are more of methodological questions. The first one goes to Dr. Barral. I am interested to know whether in the conduct of the focus group discussion, you conducted women-only focus group discussion and men only, or did you put them together? Because looking at the pictures, it appears to me that they were separated. So probably, putting them together could also give you different information that you might not get if you separate them by gender. And secondly, I saw Senegal, Dakar. I'm interested to know, how did you, given the different country context, how did you adopt the questionnaires or the data collection tools that were used? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll touch up on that side.
Thank you. My question is to Mike Rogan, and I just noted when you were presenting where you said that using the qualitative data, oh no, that's me. Okay, so you said qualitative approaches almost by definition do not account for particular nuances. And it just seems like we can't run away from this question of qual versus quant. Should we be sort of validating our qualitative data or research with some quant analysis? And for me, I don't know, this is just an idea. For me, I like quantitative data because it always gives us a summary, tells us the stats, you get the big picture. And then the qualitative data will help you to understand questions around why certain things are happening. So you can observe these trends over time or whatever. But from quantitative data, you do not always know the reasons why. And I was wondering if maybe that is a way of looking at this, where we dive into the particular context to understand the questions around why certain things are happening, perceptions and so on, which quantitative data cannot give us solutions to.
Then I'll take your question and then I'll... Okay, all right.
I don't think it's a question, I think it's a comment. I just have a reflection that doing economic related things like fits so well with intersectionality, and that for some reason there's the sense that yes, quantitative might miss nuanced understanding, but I feel like in the Global South in general, we have a very big question mark on data and numbers. In Egypt, for example, we don't have numbers. Like, you don't know how many women, how many men, what kind of disease, what kind of income. It's all a blur. So I think, like Dr. Jamila, I think, said, a merge of both is always great, but what do we do in places where numbers are blurred or are just not there?
But do you want to take? Okay, so maybe just
and also to say that Mike is downplaying his contributions to this paper. But yeah, related to Suhaila's question, and to me, it's not so much about where the data is not available, but what to do with the existing data that kind of lacks the complexity that intersectionality is intended to bring out. And we do a lot of work on kind of labor economics. And I mean, the limitations of QLFS, for instance, or even any household-related data, and to also speak to the comment from Collins as well around how we define, what we understand as being gender, right? And also, as we're trying to approach these questions of, how people identify, and also kind of, the nuances of experiences that we can pull from that. What do we do with the existing data that has these limitations, or how do we actually build onto that in a way that, might be more useful for addressing the issues in these contexts?
yeah.
So, Prof, I think all the questions are directed to you. So let me just maybe give him time to respond, and then I'll come to you.
Do you want the mic? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. All good questions and things we think about all the time. Yeah, I mean, happy to go into much more detail in terms of the tools. But essentially what we were trying to do is provide an overall report that could show how, in different contexts, there was a disproportionate impact on informal workers at that particular time. So we had to design a tool that would be usable across all 11 cities, measuring quantitatively things that we could report. And we know how to do those things. We're fairly good at that, but it did lack some of the depth. So we started by working with the alliances of each of those worker groups and reaching out to them, identifying contexts. And then in those contexts, we developed research partnerships within the alliance of workers. And we had a very short period of time to hash out across 11 cities with groups of 4 different groups of workers, what the priorities were for the tools to measure. So it was consultative and collegial, but very, very brief, because that could go on for years, right? If we all sat down and said, what's the priority for this research? So we had this sort of collaborative approach to quickly designing a quantitative tool using the types of instruments from labor force surveys and things that we're very familiar with to measure the key things, the impact on job losses, health and earnings and things like that, so that we could map that out across 11 contexts and the different worker groups in those 11 contexts. And then we said, but we know there's a lot more to uncover. So tell us how to design the focus groups and the interviews so that we can get the nuance there as well. And to be honest, we could probably spend the rest of our lives analyzing those data. Very, very nuanced. But we were very quickly trying to produce materials that we could use for advocacy. So, the nuance was there, and that kind of what filled in the gaps across the 11 cities. But we were very much trying to measure some of the same core indicators to demonstrate the impact of the pandemic. Late nights, lots of late nights, and at least 11 time zones. And the quantitative and qualitative combination as well. I think in some circles, I've dabbled in sort of intersectionality readings. My wife is a feminist psychologist, so we have all of this type of thing in the household. And in her world, the quantitative people come under, they cop a bit more flack, I think, for an economist in particular. Yeah, we run roughshod over nuance sometimes, but I appreciate that's not always the case, and there is power in numbers, and there's a role for both, and I think that is the sensible position, really. But in intersectionality, I don't think it would be unfair to say that the numbers people or the quantitative people do kind of get a bit of stick for missing the bigger picture. And then that is the one priority, I think, is the need for data. And here WeGo has sort of been a game changer. And I really can say that this time because I was not involved, but every ICLS, every ILO meeting, WeGo sends a delegation under the fierce leadership of Joanne Vanek from erstwhile of UN Women, and with alliances of workers, and they go and they fight for every single step of the way so that we can measure in more countries and harmonize so we can compare across countries. 20 years ago, we weren't able to say much outside of like the US and a couple of European countries. Now we have a common agreed framework for defining informal employment. And the latest fight, and while we're sitting here, they're up in Geneva fighting for the concept of dependent contractors so that we can measure better Uber drivers, Uber delivery drivers, and not pretend that they're entrepreneurs, right? So it goes on. So we need data on that type of thing. And that's where WeGo's really been fantastic. But it's a separate program in WeGo that focused specifically on raising the visibility and being able to measure this, because you need data. Because without data, it's tough to make your case. Yeah. Is that fair? Oh, sorry. I thought your question was to yourself.
Okay, I'll just let you, you can hold on to that mic in case there are other questions. Are there any questions online? Yeah. Oh, Srinjan. Okay, can you just like quickly repeat it and then I'll give it.
No, I wanted to know what was the rationale behind having separated focus group discussion for the different sex, men and women. And I was thinking maybe putting them together. It depends on the context. There are certain highly conservative contexts where it is not ethically advisable for you to put them together. But also in more liberal societies, you can also put them together, and that might give you different information, different from when you separate them.
Srinjana, I hope you got the question. Would you like to unmute yourself and respond?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Actually, like the focus group discussions, as you shared, are contextual and situational as well. So we did have focus group discussions where we only had single women or widow women, and then we had ethnic women groups, and then we also had a mixed groups. So it depends on the situation and also the context or the thing that we are discussing actually with the groups. So it's not only the picture that reflects everything, but in the context of having a very strong patriarchal society, if we do not have separate focus group discussions for women, then there are chances that you lose the nuances, right? Because there are cultural barriers, and in the rural setting, there is a very strong relationship between the individuals. We share that strong social bonding. So women hesitate to share any stories of exclusions that would be against their family members or their relatives, so their close relatives as well as the distant relatives as well. So it is not intended that we do not want to, like, for us gender is not only women, right? So we want to discuss the gendered power relations. So there are times where we have the mixed groups. For example, we were doing the couple trainings, right? So it was the man and women participating from each household, or the entrepreneur's husband or wife participating in the training program, where we could explain the sources or the forms of discriminations that women were facing at the household level and at the societal level as well. So it depends on the situation. It's very contextual and situational. Maybe my co-author has even more experiences. You would want to share something? I think it's very contextual. It's not, we are not isolating or like separating anyone, but it depends on the situation. So we had both the opinions, and we did not want to miss the nuances.
Sriana, I think you have said very nicely, explained very well. I don't see any need to explain more. I agree to what you said.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I did note 2 hands, so I am going to give it to you and then to you, Courtney.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julian Valencia from the Colombian Embassy. As you imagine, I come from the more practitioner world, and I will take your word, Professor Rogan, in the sense that we need the academics to get to know the knowledge and the data to put that in an actual actionable public policy. I don't really have a question, it's more like a comment. And we are glad that to understand how these intersectional studies are put in practice to relieve the needs on the populations and the communities that have been under study. And I take this opportunity to open an invitation, because our embassy and our ambassador, Maria Rosario Mina, is very interested in this kind of researches. We are more able to open spaces to create more awareness on this topic. And please feel free to contact us. My colleague Ivan is going to be here tomorrow as well. So if you have any project, any possible cooperation that we can help with, we are more than happy to help with any initiative that you may have.
Yes, thank you. So I am Ivan Mendoza Benitez, also from the Colombia Embassy. And as my colleague Julian has just mentioned, Colombia currently has in place the first feminist foreign policy in our history. And having said that, the reason why we are inviting all of you and we wait until the end of this session is because, in fact, Colombia is the second most unequal country in Latin America and the Caribbean, according to the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, after Brazil. Gender-based violence against women, girls, and LGBTIQ persons is a widespread reality in Colombia and has affected disproportionately ethnic minorities and women human rights defenders, in particular Afro-Colombians. Currently, there is a political process at the African Union that is recognizing the 6th region, so Afro-descendant people. So those are one of the minorities most affected. And therefore, for us, intersectionality might be helpful to understand this reality and help policymakers in our country, Colombia, in a negotiation process of laws, but also national development plans to tackle these issues. And with the, as I said, the first feminist foreign policy in place in Colombia is because we have the first progressist government in 200 years of democratic history. So the government is very keen to work with grassroots organizations, with NGOs, to work together on these particular matters. And that's why the instruction of our ambassador was to come here and to establish those contacts, because even though it's very important to also mention our Vice President of the Republic, Francilena Marquez, is the first Afro-descendant woman to have this position in Colombia. And she comes from the grassroots organizations. She comes from the civil society movement. So that's why our government also have the Africa Strategy 2022-2026, and there are funds for this type of projects. So that will be very helpful for us to maybe establish those contacts tomorrow. I will be here and to explore those possibilities and put you in contact with the relevant offices and authorities in our country, so you can also have Colombia in your radar, Global South, so to maybe have an expansion of your knowledge that we consider is very pivotal to understand our realities and our challenges for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. My name's Courtney Holland. I'm a postdoc at SCIS. My question is for Mike and Sibiwe. I was just wondering a bit more about the findings, key findings on your study. And I know the one slide kind of outlined some of the themes of your survey and interviews, but I was wondering if access to income assistance kind of came up in, and if you could tell us a bit about that. Awesome.
Well, they kind of had the question, and then the last time you respond.
And my question is also to Mike and Sibiwe, and especially because you both trained as economists, and I know the labor segmentation kind of literature to some extent, even though I don't come from the economics background. And I'm wondering, it's kind of I hope it's a question, but it seems to me that there's a lot of value in your report to especially scholars working around questions of labor, especially labor segmentation, who may be not only economists, but at least engaging with other economic data sets. And I think even though the intra and intersectoral, there might be other scholars and other ways that are doing something similar, but the fact that this case study does that analysis so richly, but then engages it, shows the ways in which it aligns, as you used, with intersectionality. So I'm interested in if at least, if you're already doing this, or you see possibilities of this, your research in this particular way you're bringing these two conversations together, can speak back to, economists and labor analysts in ways that could be useful beyond WeGo, but also beyond this particular piece of research. My sense is that there's a lot of value there, and I'm more interested in if those conversations are already happening and this can be inserted within them, or you see avenues for that. But my sense is there's a lot there.
Okay, so Courtney asked the question on access to income support and whether that was reflected in some of the findings. I think Mike can say a little bit more on that, but I think, part of the 11-city study, or at least the thinking before, was also looking at analyzing kind of national policies to support workers. And of course, given the location of informal workers, access to kind of forms of support from government during this time was quite a challenge. One, because, of this position which falls out of, and we can also discuss, the various informalizations within the formal sector, but being particularly within the informal sector, the lack of social protections that come with that. And then I think another thing that we found was already the kind of vulnerability of informal workers in the various countries that we were working in. That vulnerability was exacerbated during the pandemic. And at a deeper level, so we get to see in certain contexts, of course, the identity of being, or at least the issue of being informal, lacking social protections, but also a lot of the workers in certain contexts also being migrant workers within these cities that they were working within, also not necessarily having the kind of protections that come with various forms of registration and things like that. And I think this was particularly something that was relevant in the India case too, particularly during the lockdown period. But yeah, definitely issues around kind of access to income support was a challenge, and it continues to be a challenge because both not having access because of the nature of the work, so not having support from the job, but also not having the support that's coming from the government as well. And then also how I think, if I kind of recall Hannah's point about how this work can feed in or inform this, I think I'll be, an optimist in this case. There was a time when the kind of work that we do probably wouldn't even be regarded as economics, but I think the world is shifting. And there's a big interest now to actually show the realities of how the economy is experienced by communities. And I think there is space to have those conversations. And it's great to see these discussions happening across sectors, but also having that conversation, right, about, how knowledge is produced, but also who are we having these conversations to? What do we do with that knowledge beyond that? And I think the conversation is now including spaces and, activists, researchers, policymakers, practitioners, diplomats. And I think that's the kind of engagement that we need if we're actually truly wanting to address the issues that we're wanting to do. And I think the benefit, or at least WIGO's biggest strength, has always been about actually producing research for advocacy and also developing the kind of data that can actually support the improvement of lives in the informal economy.
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole module in the survey about assistance. So it wasn't just cash assistance, but it was also, there were various debt relief initiatives, food parcels, and then also, if you'll remember, some countries sort of gave sort of breaks for services, so you didn't have to free water and electricity during the crisis. So what we tried to do is measure in those 11 cities that had some sort of cash support or other type of support, whether it was reaching people and whether it was enough, and then or if the coverage was good. So in South Africa, the first round was in April, May 2000. So in South Africa, there wasn't even the idea of a social relief of distress grant then. So South Africa is one of those countries where there was basically nothing for informal sector workers. Other countries very quickly were able to sort of rejig their social protection architecture, their digital social protection systems, and actually get cash to people. We eventually did, but very slowly. But so there's a lot of nuance across the 11 cities, but if I had to summarize the findings with any type of assistance, whether it's cash or food security or services or debt relief, I would say poor coverage or uneven coverage. Where it was received, it was not enough, and it was very short-lived. So by the second round of our study, those who had received some sort of support, it was pretty much long gone. Different for South Africa, where our SRD grant was just kind of taking hold, but still very few people had coverage a year into the pandemic. And yeah, it's interesting. The labor market segmentation literature is largely sort of associated with left-leaning economists, or maybe even heterodox economists. But it's something that's interested us as being an alternative explanation for the structure of the informal sector in middle and low income countries. So as it just happens, we had worked out kind of a book project with the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economic Research, UN WIDER, to co-produce a book critiquing some of the, or exploring, depending on your level of comfort as a contributor, sort of some of the shortcomings of the conventional, the classic labor market models of understanding the structure of labor markets. And we kind of sketched out a few chapters, and our contribution was always going to be sort of labor force analyses, sort of econometric analyses, showing that segmentation is probably a more valid theory for understanding and what would that mean for policy compared to sort of the standard World Bank, IMF approach to the structure of informal sectors. And then the pandemic hit, and we did produce the book, but it was more about the pandemic and how it affected different groups of workers. So it was in my work plan for about 2 years at WeGo, was to push labor market segmentation and show how it might help us think differently about policy. So yeah, that's a question I have as well. I don't have a good sense of who needs to hear it either. I think sociologists would be very, very comfortable with hearing that and might actually point out they've been saying that for 200 years. Whereas economists, it's still kind of, it's gradually gaining acceptance, I think. And something we do at WeGo, and I'm sure other grassroots organizations do, is we put economists in this area because they have such a large impact on, oversized impact on policy. So we always feel like we need to sort of focus our attention that way, sort of providing alternative explanations for kind of the mainstream policy sort of spaces, I guess, for lack of a better word. But yeah, I'm also, it's a framework that I find quite appealing, but how much traction it'll have, I have a hard time sort of understanding or seeing. Yeah. Sibiwe, do you want to?
I like the framework because it gives the sense of degree of informality to really look at the informality.
Yeah, yeah.
Very interesting.
Thank you. So it seems like we have a few questions online. Some more. Lele, did you have a mic with you? Okay.
I don't know if there's any more questions for Mike and Sibiwe. But there are a couple of questions online. I just wanted to start off with I think Kachan is typing that one, but I'll read it aloud for everybody. But Patricia says, "Hi, I do have a question. Lama, first of all, once analyzing land security and ownership, if you consider only married, single, and widows, in your analysis, the second wives and informal spouses are also a very vulnerable group, and it seems to be totally ignored. Any reasons for considering those vulnerable groups? Also, did you include non-binary groups in the research?" That is from Patricia, and I believe Kachan is responding to that online. Do you want to also?
I would like to respond. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I think the question is very important, actually. I thank you, Patricia, for giving the question. Actually, we would not stop any second wife if there is one, but by the law in our country now, second wife is not very common. Before it was there, but these days we don't have. But even if there is one, that it was accepted. So we understand that, and we also accept your perspective. They are more vulnerable, more than others. They are considered equally. And non-binary group also, we were looking for non-binary groups in our project area, but for our, disappointment, we didn't get any. Thank you.
Thank you. We also had a question earlier on. Maybe we can just, I don't know, maybe we can factor into the discussions tomorrow since we are rounding off. It was before our lunch break. So this is from Pratima, and she says, given the linkages between GBV and power, is the education department in India, this was specific to India, and in other countries focusing on the transformation of this through curriculum development and programs for intervention at a school level. I don't think our Indian speakers are still there who are presenting, but I think it's something that maybe can factor into the discussions tomorrow and the broader thinking for this session. Thank you.
So I think we are going to close. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Siviwe, just to have our closing remarks.
No, maybe I'll go in the front. No, I'm going to be brief. Because this is, I think, often regarded the graveyard session, and I can see people are drifting. I just wanted to just give my thanks to all of the presenters for the day, and also our case study authors who joined online. I know some of our South Asian colleagues, the time difference was not really accommodating for them. So much thanks to all those who joined online. Kanchan, Srajana, Marin, I think also was joining online. So thank you all. And also to our case study authors who traveled long distances to come and join us for this 2-day workshop. I think one of our hopes for this workshop was for there to be a robust discussion, and I think the kind of engagement that you all received, even at this time in the afternoon, shows how rich all of these case studies have been for our understanding on intersectionality, just based on the context of experiences in the global south. The sessions are going to continue tomorrow, and we're looking forward to them. But thank you all.
Thank you for a very good first day. I hope you enjoyed.